I heard my son say, "If she dies, the house is ours." Yes. I heard. They didn't tell me. It wasn't an exaggeration of my tired mind, nor the imagination of a lonely old woman. I heard it with these ears that raised that boy, who one day fell asleep in my arms, trembling with fever. And he said this, so calmly, as if deciding the dinner menu. They were in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep. The house was silent, the kettle still hot. And I, in the bedroom, with the door ajar, heard everything. My daughter-in-law responded with a short laugh. "She's already weak, she shouldn't last long." It was about me. Me, Ruth. 73 years old. Mother, widow, grandmother. A woman who gave everything. I gave her home, food, care, I gave her life. And now, they were waiting for me to take my last breath too, only to inherit 4 walls they barely know how to clean. But what they didn't know is that, at that moment, something inside me woke up. A warning, a whisper, a presence. Something there was telling me, "You're not going to die now. You're going to find out everything. And you're going to turn the tables." Because yes, my body was weak, but my spirit was alert. And the following days were a waking nightmare. It started with small things. 1 medicine that disappeared. Then 2. Then all of them. I asked, "Where's my blood pressure pill?" My son replied dryly, "You already took it, Mom." But I knew better. I knew. Because I'd started writing it down. Every pill. Every schedule. Every strange look from that woman who'd come into my house saying she'd call me Mom, but now wouldn't even speak to me. The truth is, I was slowly being extinguished. Like a light that flickers until it goes out on its own. They were counting on this. On my confusion, my exhaustion, my silence. But I resisted. And that's why you're listening to me now. Before we continue, if you've ever felt like someone wanted to erase you, if you believe in divine justice, subscribe to the channel and comment, "God sees everything." Because this story cannot go unnoticed. That morning, I sat at the table with them. They pretended to be normal. They didn't even know I'd heard everything. They offered me coffee, looked me in the eyes, and lied as if I were stupid. As if age also took away our dignity. Their plan was simple. Hide the medicine, watch me waste away in silence, and when I finally stopped breathing, divide the inheritance. But that's not what happened. Because something, or someone, was protecting me. And that same week, I found out what they did. Or rather, Ass did. And Dorothy hid everything. That's when the story began to change. And you won't believe how the truth came out. Since my husband left, the house has grown bigger than me. Not in size, but in silence. He was the kind of man who always left something burning around here. A low tune on the radio, the smell of coffee, a whistle coming from the backyard. When he was gone, everything seemed to fade with it. But I kept going. For myself, for him, and for the children who still lived with me. At least, that's what I thought. My grandchildren called me Grandma Ruth, with that affection that melts any weary soul. I woke up early, made coffee, swept the porch, and tidied up the toys scattered around the living room. I took care of the house as I always had, like someone who takes care of a home, not a property. But little by little, I began to realize that my role there was changing. And it wasn't by choice. I was useful. Until I wasn't. They didn't say anything directly, of course. It's easier to hurt in silence. Short words, impatient looks, that way of taking a deep breath every time I asked something simple, like, "Have you had coffee yet?" Or "Do you need help with the boys?" I felt it. We feel it. The body ages, but a woman's intuition only sharpens. It was during this phase that I began to feel the absences. Not of visits or calls, because those had been scarce for a while, but of small, concrete things. A medicine of mine that wasn't in the medicine cabinet. Then another. Then the entire pack. And the worst part? I began to doubt myself. Did I take it and forget? Did I store it somewhere else? Am I really starting to fail? Doubt is an invisible weapon. It starts small, then corrodes everything. And in the midst of this internal turmoil, I did something that changed the course of my own story. I started writing things down. I grabbed an old notebook and wrote by hand, in my shaky handwriting, Monday, 8 a.m. I had a high blood pressure. Just like that, one by one. A simple, almost childish act, but it gave me back some control. Still, I remained silent. I didn't accuse anyone. I just watched. It was during this period that I realized how uncomfortable my presence was. Not directly, but in the way they stopped talking when I entered the room. How they whispered when I went into the backyard. How my daughter-in-law smiled with empty eyes, not even trying to hide it anymore. She thought I didn't notice. They thought I was just a frail old woman, overcome by the years. But they forget that the time that wrinkles us is the same time that teaches us. That house, once a symbol of unity, now seemed like the scene of a dirty game. And I was the obstacle. A piece of furniture that prevented sharing. But what they didn't know was that, behind that slow-moving woman, there was someone who still saw every gesture, who felt every energy, and who was beginning to piece together the puzzle. It was a silent, almost rehearsed routine. Day after day, I observed the times my son went out and she was alone with me. The excuses for leaving me unsupervised for hours, as if hoping something would happen. If she gets sick, we'll call the ambulance later. I heard on a day when they probably didn't know I was awake. The impact wasn't immediate. It was like a drop falling every day in the same place. Until the crack appeared. And the crack was something banal. An empty bottle thrown in the yard trash. It was one of my medications. One that was finished, according to my son. It could have been a coincidence. It could. But truth has a habit of leaving traces. Traces that, even hastily erased, remain in the memory of those who have learned to observe in silence. And with each step I took, the more I understood that what seemed like oblivion was, in fact, a plan. That's when something changed inside. A mixture of pain, anger, and a strength I didn't know I still possessed. The feeling was that someone was pushing me forward, as if to say, you haven't finished your journey yet. And I began to remember everything I'd built, everything I'd been. Not just a mother. Not just a widow. But a woman who, though invisible to many, still carried the truth within her. And that truth was about to come to light. It didn't take long for the tension that had previously lurked beneath the surface to become more evident and painful. It was on a sultry afternoon, the kind when even the clock seems tired, that I heard the sentence that turned everything upside down. I was in my bedroom, sitting on the edge of my bed, my notebook on my lap, checking my medication schedule. The window was ajar, and the sound of the conversation in the kitchen reached me with cruel clarity. If we stop giving the medicine, it will soon resolve. The voice belonged to my son. The one I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through feverish nights, and defended so many times even when I was making mistakes. The same one who was now coldly articulating what seemed like a calculated plan. His wife responded quietly, I couldn't quite make out, but her tone was one of agreement. And in that moment, I felt my stomach churn as if I'd swallowed a handful of rocks. I wanted to get up, go over there, face them. I wanted to scream, cry, demand an explanation. But something held me back. Perhaps instinct, perhaps an ancient wisdom that only time brings. Instead, I remained silent, feeling the pain invade every corner of my body, as if I were witnessing my own trial, but without the right to defend myself. Betrayal has a taste that's hard to describe, but those who have experienced it know exactly what I'm talking about. The next day, I confronted him. I told him I'd noticed the meds disappearing, that I'd been writing everything down, that I wasn't crazy. And he, with practiced calm, looked me in the eye and said, Mom, you're paranoid. You're forgetting things. We only want the best for you. That's when I realized, the game wasn't just physical, it was mental. They wanted to confuse me, isolate me from my own perception, erase my confidence from the inside out. This decision to confront them opened the door to a new kind of cruelty. More silent, more cunning. They began hiding food. I'd go looking for fruit in the bowl. It would disappear. I'd look for bread in the cupboard. Nothing. The excuse was always the same. It's all gone, Mom. We'll buy it later. But that later never came. Even the water sometimes tasted strange. I began to wonder if they weren't trying to slowly weaken me, as if my existence were a nuisance to be slowly dissolved. They also began to ignore my correspondence. Letters that once arrived directly in my hands were now thrown away because they weren't important. Some of them came from the bank. Others from my health insurance plan. Things they knew I needed to keep track of, but which were removed from my reach as part of a deliberate control. I, who had always been an independent woman, in control of my own decisions, was now surrounded by invisible barriers that prevented me from carrying out even the simplest routines. In this scenario, I realized it wasn't just about my physical health anymore. It was about my identity. They were trying to erase Ruth, the woman who endured a difficult marriage, who lost a young son, who supported an entire household with dignity even in the hardest times. The woman who never stopped reaching out, even when life pulled the rug out from under her. Now, at the end of the journey, I was reduced to a body waiting for the end. But they forgot one detail. I was still alive. And I knew too much. The small daily cruelties, the averted glances, the backhanded answers, the hidden food, the false words spoken with a smile, were no longer disguised. There was something in the air, a kind of pent-up impatience, like someone waiting for a set time for something to happen. And I noticed every step, every gesture, as if I'd acquired a new lens. It was a kind of silent transformation dawning on me, a clarity that only comes when the soul decides it will no longer accept being diminished. It wasn't just anger that grew inside me. It was something deeper. A kind of invisible firmness that emerges when we have nothing left to lose. I began to see my home as a backstage scene, where everything was rehearsed, where the characters faked their lines with a perverse script that excluded me. But they forget that even backstage has cameras. And I was watching it all. I didn't tell anyone. I kept observing. Taking notes. Making appointments. What had seemed like forgetfulness was now proof. What had once been intuition was now evidence. And each new move reinforced a hidden truth that could no longer be ignored. I was living under attack. An attack disguised as care. And if I did nothing, they would get exactly what they wanted. But life has curious ways of working. Because when the world starts to close in on itself, sometimes help comes from where we least expect it. And this time it would come in the form of something, or someone, no one in that house could control. The pain began as a faint tightness in my chest, but soon spread like wildfire. It was a muggy, windless morning, the kind that makes the air feel heavy, almost thick. I woke with that strange sensation that something wasn't right inside my body. It was different from the pains before. This one had a heaviness, an urgency. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't budge. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I called for my son. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. The house, which usually echoed every sound, seemed deaf that day. I dragged myself to the bedroom door, my heart racing and my hands shaking, and discovered it was locked. From the outside. As if I were a danger. As if I were an object that should remain there, isolated, out of reach. I, who had once been the foundation of that family, was now kept under lock and key. I tried to knock on the door, but I couldn't. My voice was breaking. I was sweating. It was as if the world were getting narrower, more muffled, more distant. With each passing second, the realization that this wasn't just an oversight, but a choice, became clearer. They knew I was in trouble. And they chose not to open the door. I crept to the window, hoping to see someone on the street. But that day, the world outside seemed to have disappeared. I screamed. At least I tried. My voice came out choked, strangled, almost soundless. No neighbors appeared. Not a single living soul. It was a moment of cruel revelation. No one would come. I was alone. And that's how I spent the next few hours. Maybe days, who knows? Time lost its shape. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, my heart beating like an out-of-time drum. I slept and woke without knowing what day it was. The pain came in waves. So did hunger and thirst. My body ached, but what weighed most heavily was the total absence of humanity. The certainty that if I died there, they wouldn't open the door until long enough to ensure it was too late. It's in these moments that we truly find ourselves. When all you have is your own fragile body, a persistent memory, and the faith that still lingers. It was there, sitting on the cold floor of the room where I was locked, that I began to talk to my deceased self. Not out loud, but inside myself. I remembered the conversations we'd had, the advice he'd given me, the silent promises we'd made to each other. And suddenly, even faintly, I began to feel something different. As if a forgotten part of my soul was resurfacing. This crisis wasn't just physical. It was a rupture. A deep cut between who I was and who I needed to become. And I knew, with an almost spiritual clarity, that this pain was a turning point. Not because I had the strength, but because I had nothing left to lose. The transformation began there, silently, while the outside world remained unaware that a woman, discredited by everyone, was rebuilding herself from the inside out. I can't say exactly how much time passed. I remember falling asleep with my face pressed against the wall, listening for any sound that might indicate life on the other side of the door. A footstep. A voice. The rattle of a key. Nothing. The feeling of utter abandonment was what hurt the most. It wasn't just about health. It was about worth. About dignity. About being disposable. My body began to adapt to the pain. When hunger struck, I slept. When thirst burned, I licked my cracked lips. It was as if my body had entered survival mode. And, curiously, it was in this almost primal state that a memory returned. Something my mother had told me when I was a girl. Ruth, even when the world turns its back on you, God still sees everything. It was this phrase that kept me awake, alive, alert. And, little by little, I began to notice signs that something was changing. The sounds of the house reappeared. Footsteps in the hallway. Low voices. Clothes being washed. The key finally turning in the lock. But no one came in. They just unlocked the door and left it ajar. As if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't stood there, on the brink of death. I tried to get up, and my body resisted, but I did. I leaned against the wall, went to the mirror, and saw myself. Thin. Deep-set eyes. But still there. I walked slowly down to the kitchen. They were in the backyard, talking quietly. They didn't see me. And it was at that moment that I heard another sentence. Short, almost a whisper, but with immense impact. "Is she still alive?" My son asked, as if talking about a pest that insists on resisting the drought. And my daughter-in-law replied, "Nearly. But it won't last." It was no longer a doubt. It was certainty. It was revelation. It wasn't paranoia. It was a plan. And they were certain I wouldn't have the strength to find out more. But little did they know, something, or someone, was already starting to act on my behalf. The morning after that phrase still echoing in my ears. "Is she still alive?" Something strange happened. The house was eerily silent, but not like other days. It was a different silence, as if the air were heavy, dense, filled with something unseen. I felt everything more intensely. The sounds of creaking wood. The ticking of the living room clock. The smell of coffee burning in the kitchen because, once again, they'd forgotten about me. It was around 10 o'clock when there was a knock on the door. 3 sharp, spaced knocks. Still weak, I went to the living room window and peered through the crack in the curtain. It was a woman I'd never seen before. She was wearing a simple dress, old sandals, her hair tied in a tight bun, and she was holding something in her hands, a kind of small embroidered cloth bag, like the ones my mother used to store herbs when I was a girl. She waited a little longer, and when she didn't hear a response, she approached the window where I was. She didn't see me, but she spoke firmly, as if she knew exactly why I was there. I'm Miriam. I moved into the house on the corner yesterday. I passed by here this morning and felt a strange weight coming from this house. Something bad. As if someone here was being suffocated, but not just physically, by the soul. My breath caught. Not from surprise, but from the way she spoke. Definitely. With pain. With a kind of sensitivity that only those who have suffered greatly can carry. I opened the door slowly. She looked me in the eye with silent respect. She didn't ask my name. She didn't want to know what was going on. She simply held out the small cloth bundle and said, "Your husband appeared to me in a dream. He said he needed to send me here. He's angry. He said you're in danger and they won't stop. But he also said you're not alone. He asked me to give you this. It's a protection. Made of rue, rosemary, and white rose. But there's more to it. His doing. Something only you will understand." I trembled. I don't know if it was from fear, excitement, or because that name, his name, hadn't been spoken with such force in a long time. I picked up the little package, and in that instant, I felt a warmth rise in my hands. It wasn't that I believed or didn't believe in that kind of thing. But there was an energy there. An intensity that shattered any doubt. Miriam didn't stay long. She told me I should keep it close to where I slept, but not too exposed. And that I would begin to see things more clearly. Before leaving, she looked me in the eye again and said something that sent shivers down my spine. "They think you're weak, but they've forgotten that those who were once mothers never die completely. The rest of your strength comes when justice begins to move." He walked back down the same sidewalk, slowly disappearing. And I stood there, holding that little bag tightly in my hands like a key. I went back to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and carefully opened it. The smell was strong, but good. An old smell. Familiar. Inside, besides the herbs, was something wrapped in paper. A small photograph of me and my husband, from the time when we still wore matching outfits on Sundays. And a folded note in his handwriting. That crooked but firm handwriting. "Don't be afraid. You know where to look." My heart raced. The impact of that revelation was almost physical. How could he have left something? When? Where to look? And why? My instincts led me straight to the backyard. I can't explain it. I just went. Every step felt like part of a silent choreography, as if everything had already been written. I walked to the base of the fig tree, where he used to sit in the afternoons to read the newspaper. It was the only corner of the house that still had his energy. The wind there was different. The ground there was different. And that's when I noticed. The earth was disturbed. Someone had moved it. Recently. I went back inside, grabbed a long-handled spoon, the longest I could carry with what little strength I had left, and began digging slowly. My heart pounding. Sweat beaded on my temples. It was as if I were digging not just into the earth, but into the truth. A few minutes later, the spoon hit something hard. I continued. I scooped up more dirt. And then I saw it. A black plastic bag, the kind they use in the kitchen, tied with duct tape. I picked it up with my hands, and when I opened it, I nearly fell to my knees. There were my medications. All of them. Unbroken. With the labels still attached. Including the most expensive ones, which my son said were out of stock. And next to them, another photo. Me, my baby son, and my husband holding them both. 3 generations in one image. And on the back, written in the same crooked handwriting, "They forgot that what is rightfully theirs, no one can take." I stood there for a few minutes. Everything inside me trembled. This was more than proof. It was a message. An answer. And most importantly, it was a sign that I'd been right all along. The truth had come out of the ground. Literally. And now, it could no longer be buried. I went back inside with that bag in my hands as if I were carrying a secret from another world. My medications were there. All of them. with the dosages intact, the names correct, just as I remembered. My heart raced as if it wanted to scream the truth all by itself. It was all real. I wasn't confusing anything. They hid, buried, concealed from me something that was rightfully mine. My health, my autonomy, my life. I walked to the bedroom with firm steps. My legs were still shaking, but inside I felt a new strength, an energy I hadn't felt in a long time. Something had been ignited. And it wasn't just the certainty that I was right, but the confirmation that my intuition had never betrayed me. The problem was that I kept quiet out of respect, for fear of sounding like the crazy old lady, as I'd heard myself called behind my back. But what I held in my hands wasn't imagination. It was evidence. I closed the door carefully and hid the bag under the bed. I grabbed one of the bottles, the one for blood pressure, and took the pill right there, with water from the glass I always kept by my bed. My eyes filled with tears. Not from sadness, but from quiet relief. It wasn't the medicine that worked miracles, but the feeling that I had finally regained a shred of my control. And so began my second journey, a kind of silent resistance. A secret plan, made on the edge between fear and hope. I began gradually returning to the medication, with controlled schedules, hiding each bottle in different places in the room. One behind the wardrobe, another inside the sewing box, another in the false lining of an old purse. By this point, I no longer trusted anyone in there except myself and that woman who knocked on my door bearing not only herbs, but a warning. Miriam returned 2 days later. She brought a simple cake and said it was cornmeal, with a taste of childhood. She smiled with her eyes, as if she already knew everything, but respected my time. I sat with her on the porch, the cake between us, the birds singing in the background as if the universe wanted to remind me that life still happened, even amidst so much abandonment. I told her what I had found, showed her the photo, the note. She held my hand and said, "You've been through more than anyone can imagine. But now it's time to decide what to do with this." That phrase stuck in my head for days. It was more than advice. It was a call to action. A change of mindset. I was no longer just a victim. I held in my hands the hidden truth, dug from the earth like a time capsule. A revelation that, if used well, could turn the fate of that house upside down. But I didn't want blind revenge. I wanted conscience. I wanted justice with dignity. I knew I couldn't confront them directly. Not yet. The power of surprise was my only weapon. So I began observing more strategically. I began paying attention to their departure times, the tone of their conversations, the whispers between forced laughter. Little by little, I understood it wasn't just disrespect. It was greed. A veiled rush to get me out of the way. Reviewing the household routine, I noticed how everything revolved around them. The children were served as if they were guests. The grandchildren were left in my care with the excuse that I liked it. The truth. I was used. As a nanny, as a cook, as a housewife. But with no rights whatsoever. No voice, no choice. Just obligations. And now, not even a remedy. It became clear that this wasn't just negligence. It was systematic manipulation. A cruel architecture built with meticulously calculated decisions. Their every move was intentional. And I, once the center of that house, was now treated like a nuisance that needed to disappear naturally. But my journey was far from over. Something inside me grew stronger with each passing day. The medication began to take effect. The constant headache disappeared. The morning dizziness vanished. Even my memory, which they'd always said was failing, started working like clockwork again. It was as if my body was saying, "Now it's up to you." One of those mornings, I went out into the backyard again. Not to dig, but to feel. I looked at the fig tree and remembered when my husband planted that sapling, saying, "This tree will outlive both of us." And right then and there, I realized he might have been right. But what he didn't know was that I, too, would outlive them both. Because now I had proof, clarity, and time. And more than that, I had rediscovered who I was. And that truth, though long buried, had now resurfaced as a force no one could stop. As my body slowly responded, I began to feel whole again. Not whole as before, that time was long gone, but whole in a different way, with a different strength, the strength of someone who has survived a silent attempt at erasure. And not just survived. I was returning. But this time, my eyes were much wider. Now I saw everything more clearly. The cold gestures, the forced silences, the false favors. The backstage of my own home was exposed, and every detail screamed a truth I hadn't wanted to see before. I started waking up earlier, before them. I drank my coffee in silence, put on my slippers, and went out to the backyard to walk my laps. My body still ached, but with each step, a sense of autonomy returned to me. The transformation was happening, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. With each steadying breath, I felt less fear, and more desire. I began to do what I'd always put off, open the forgotten drawers of my husband's desk. They'd been there since he died, untouched, as if time had stood still in that corner of the house. There were old receipts, yellowed letters, a few photographs, but what caught my attention was a red folder with a faded label. Household documents. Written in his handwriting. I sat on the floor, with the folder open on my lap. I turned page after page, and the more I read, the more a strange feeling grew within me. It was a kind of serene wonder, as if life were handing me the right tools, at the right time, to reclaim what was mine by right, not by inheritance. There was the original purchase contract for the house, signed by him. Beneath it, a clause highlighted in blue pen clearly stated, "In the event of death, the property will remain in the name of the surviving spouse, and any attempt to sell or transfer it without the direct and notarized consent of the owner is prohibited." I read that section at least 5 times, as if needing to confirm with my own eyes that yes, that house was still mine. Legally, morally, emotionally, mine. A wave of relief mixed with anger coursed through me. They were there, holding me prisoner, waiting for my death like a winning ticket falling into their lap, and they didn't even know their plan was legally impossible. They couldn't sell, they couldn't transfer, they couldn't even negotiate that house without my signature. It was as if my husband, even after death, was still protecting me from an unworthy future. This revelation was a turning point for me. Not because of the house's material value, but because of the symbol it became. It was the last place where my story still lived. The walls of that house had already heard my mother's cries, my wife's laughter, my weary silences. And now, it was becoming a territory of resistance. Not only against my own children, but against everything they tried to do to me. Silence me, erase me, push me to the end. I began to reorganize my routines with more intention. I started writing in my notebook again. Not just my medication schedules, but also everything they said, everything I saw, the times they went out, who they talked to. It wasn't just for safety, it was to keep my sanity sharp. I turned that notebook into a silent weapon. A chronology of injustice. A survival diary. They noticed my change. Of course they did. They commented among themselves that I seemed more willing. My daughter-in-law made a cheeky comment. She must have been faking all that to get attention. Little did they know that I had hit rock bottom and come back with baggage they would never understand. The mindset that guided me now was different. I no longer expected affection. I no longer sought understanding. I no longer asked for inclusion. I was there for myself. For my story. For the dignity I refused to bury along with my medication. This was a journey from the inside out, silent but irreversible. And the more I read those old documents, the more I realized how prepared my husband had been for me, even without me knowing it. It was as if he knew on some deep level that one day I would need to fight alone. And he, in his own way, left me with the right tools. That week, I rearranged the rooms. I put my photos back in their frames. I took down the cold paintings my daughter-in-law had hung on the walls. I made beans with garlic and bay leaves. My way. The house began to remember me. Or maybe it was me remembering the woman I was. And still am. I didn't say anything to them. The key to transformation was precisely not showing that anything had changed. I let them think I was still the same. Because sometimes, the greatest strategy is silence. And it was in this silence that I began to plot something greater. Something born not of resentment, but of truth. The truth they thought they had buried with me. But which, ironically, was about to blossom in the very place where they thought my end would be. The changes began slowly, like a breeze that passes without anyone noticing. But gradually, they became a gale. The first sign was my oldest son's silence. He was always the most talkative, the one who would come in from the street slamming the door, talking loudly on his cell phone, demanding that dinner be ready. But that week, he started walking with his head down, slow, and a strange expression on his face. He said he was tired, that it must be some virus. He didn't pay much attention. He never did, especially when it came to his own health. But the virus didn't go away. And it got worse. The pain started in his joints. Then came dizziness, nausea, and constant malaise. One day, he fainted in the living room. They called emergency services. The doctors ran tests, took him to 3 hospitals, but no one could find an explanation. Clinically normal, they said. Nothing serious, maybe emotional. But I could see in his eyes that it wasn't emotional. It was something deeper. As if something were unraveling inside. As if his body were returning to the world everything it had tried to take from me. Meanwhile, the other son, the middle one, who rarely showed up and only called when he needed money, was fired. They said the company had closed a department and cut long-time employees. He came here with a suitcase in hand and a blank expression, asking to stay for a few days. He said it was temporary. His wife stayed in the city, waiting for him to sort things out. But I knew. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was life doing what no one believed. Giving back. Suddenly I, the forgotten woman at the head of the table, became the balance of the house. The 2 of them, now living under my roof, one ill, the other unemployed, began to feel a discomfort that didn't stem solely from physical pain or lack of money. It was the discomfort of being in the presence of someone they'd tried to erase. And now, this same woman was holding the fort, of cooking, of organizing, even of chatting with the neighbors. Because the neighborhood, they didn't let it go. They started talking on the sidewalks, at the gate, in conversations at the butcher's. Life takes its toll, doesn't it? They'd say with sidelong glances, as if they knew more than they were saying. 1 or 2 came up to me with a strange affection, full of half-words. You're strong, you know, Mrs. Ruth. God is watching everything. I just smiled out of the corner of my mouth. Because right there, in that moment, I already knew something bigger was afoot. Attitudes at home changed too. They no longer spoke loudly to me. They no longer called me paranoid. They started asking me where things were, asking for advice on what to do with the bills, their medications, problems I hadn't even known existed before. I began to notice a different look in their eyes. It wasn't affection yet. It was recognition. It was a kind of uncomfortable respect. Like someone who understands, through pain, who truly holds the foundations of a home together. But I didn't take advantage. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't demand, I didn't humiliate. Because that's not me. What I did was the opposite. I started organizing the house even more calmly, even more firmly. I established rules again. Schedules. Routines. I went back to using my chair at the head of the table. And they understood. Not because I asked. But because reality now was different. It was during this process that I discovered something powerful. When we begin to live with dignity again, the world around us begins to adjust. The little things make a difference. The food I prepare is now praised, not ignored. The rooms I used to walk through unnoticed now fall silent when I enter. The television is turned down when I want to sleep. It may seem small, but these are signs. Signs that the cycle has turned. And yet, there was no joy in it. It was a bitter relief. Because all this change came with pain, with disillusionment, with a breach of trust so profound that it may never fully recover. But it also came with truth. And truth is what transforms. The curious thing is that, even with all this, my house felt more alive. The plants bloomed more. The garden, which had previously been dry, was now visited by butterflies. I began to notice this when I went for my short morning walks. Miriam said this was a sign of spiritual cleansing, that when the energy shifts, even nature notices. And, somehow, I believed it. Because the hidden truth I carried was coming to light. And the impact of this was greater than any revenge. My children didn't yet know about the house clause. Or the documents. They still thought I had nothing in my hands but a cup of tea and a blank stare. But that was my choice. Because there's a right time for everything. And in that moment, what I needed to do was keep observing. Because the most powerful transformation isn't the one that explodes, it's the one that reveals itself slowly, until no one can deny it anymore. That morning, the sun was slow to rise. The sky was cloudy, but the air lacked the weight of other days. It was as if the world were suspended, waiting for something to happen. I was in the kitchen, calmly stirring the coffee, when I heard slow footsteps coming from the hallway. They weren't the usual hurried steps, nor the stumbling of the previous week. They were heavy footsteps, the kind accompanied by a screaming silence. My son walked into the kitchen. His face was pale, his dark circles were deep, his old faded shirt was worn. For the first time, he didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, his eyes lowered. I grabbed a cup, poured the coffee, and slowly pushed it across the table. He sat down. He took a deep breath. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Mom, help me." Those words hit me like a contained storm. Not because I hadn't expected it, but because, until then, he had never acknowledged weakness. He had never seen me as someone capable of offering anything beyond work, beyond obligation. I could have responded in 1,000 ways. I could have cried, screamed, exposed everything right then and there. But no. I took a deep breath too. And I responded with the firmness that life has taught me to cultivate in silence. "Now you will learn to care for the one you tried to kill." He looked up immediately. The shock in his eyes was almost physical. A mixture of guilt, pain, regret, and fear. There was no denial. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply lowered his head again, as if understanding that what comes next isn't punishment. It's a consequence. We were silent for a few seconds. Only the sound of the spoon hitting the rim of the cup filled the space between us. Then I stood up. I went to my desk drawer and took out the red folder. The same one that contained the house documents, with the clause guaranteeing me everything. Beside it, I placed another sheet, a handwritten declaration of relinquishment of all rights to the property, with the date, full name, and space for my signature. I returned, placed the folder in front of him. I opened it calmly. I showed him the documents. I read the clause aloud. I spoke unhurriedly, using simple words. There was no anger in my tone, only certainty. This was a moment that didn't require shouting. It required clarity. When I finished, I pushed the white sheet of paper in front of him and said, "You'll sign. Not for me, but for you. To understand that those who destroy bonds out of greed end up alone, and that those who try to take another's life lose the right to hide behind their surname." He looked at me with teary eyes. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He just picked up the pen with a trembling hand and signed. Each letter written with effort, with pain, with regret. And at the end, a tear fell onto the paper. He tried to wipe it away, but I held his hand. "Leave it. Let it be remembered. May you never forget what you almost did." I put the paper back in the folder. I locked it with the key that always hung on the chain around my neck. He still stood there, motionless, his face in his hands. This wasn't humiliation. It was justice. It was the impact of truth finally prevailing over lies. The days that followed were silent. He began helping around the house as best he could. Still sick, but now present. He washed the dishes, tidied his room, and babysat his grandchildren when his daughter-in-law wasn't around. I watched everything from the necessary distance. I knew part of it was guilt, part was fear. But there was also a small trace of transformation. As if he were, little by little, seeing what he never wanted to see. The other son, the unemployed one, became quieter, less arrogant. He started leaving early to look for work and started calling me Mom again, something he hadn't done in months. Perhaps for the first time, they were looking at me not as an obstacle, but as the pillar that held everything together while they only thought about taking advantage. It wasn't easy. Each step required self-control, vigilance, and wisdom. But I knew, it's not about winning, it's about not letting them defeat us. And there, in that simple kitchen, with the smell of coffee and a signed document on the table, I knew the battle was turning. And yet, something inside me told me there was more to come. More revelations, more adjustments, more decisions. Because the journey of truth doesn't end when someone signs a piece of paper. It only changes shape. And now, with the pieces moving again, I needed to be ready. Because what began in silence was about to become impossible to hide. I cared for him. Yes, I did. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to not carry any more guilt than life had already placed on me. But I cared within my limits. Without sacrificing myself. Without repeating the cycle of giving myself away until I disappeared. I prepared his medicine, organized his schedule, carried his plate to the living room, but made it clear with my eyes. I haven't forgotten. There was something new in that routine, a quiet dignity never before present. He accepted my help with downcast eyes, as if acknowledging a debt unpaid with words. There were no apologies. Just restrained, slower, more careful gestures. His illness seemed to have revealed something that had always been hidden, his humanity. And yet, the wound was still too fresh for me to call it reconciliation. It was more of a process. A journey. Each day, I laid a new brick on this path back to myself. A cake baked with love, a plant watered with care, a page of a book read on the porch. Small decisions that, together, rebuilt my identity. Now, I was no longer just their mother, nor just their widow. I was Ruth. The woman who survived the cruelest attempt at erasure, that of her own family. Donor Miriam, on the other hand, became more than a neighbor. She became a mirror, a presence that reminded me of true friendship. We would sit together in the late afternoon, talking about life, about the past, about the pains our bodies and the world had left us. She didn't see me as a poor thing, nor as a victim. She saw me as a woman. And that healed a part of me I didn't even know was hurt. She taught me about herbs, about protection, about spirituality. She spoke of dreams with a lucidity that only those who have been through a lot can achieve. One day, she said to me, looking into my eyes, "Some people are born with a protected soul, Ruth. And that soul can withstand poison that would destroy any other." I remained silent. Because in that moment, I understood. That protection that kept me alive when everything around me seemed to want to bury me, that wasn't luck. It was ancestral strength. It was faith. It was something greater than any medical report, greater than any will, greater even than the blood that unites us. The house, once a scene of fear, began to smell like home again. The curtains danced in the wind again. The furniture stopped creaking as if protesting injustice. I returned to placing fresh flowers on the living room table. Not to decorate for others, but for myself. Because I was, finally, inhabiting that place again, not as a shadow, but as a whole presence. And as for the children, one relearned to move around the house quietly, without demanding anything. The other started helping out more, actually talking to his grandchildren, not just out of obligation. I observed everything with the eyes of someone who'd seen too much. I didn't expect miracles. I expected consistency. And, for now, it was coming slowly but surely. My heart never felt the same again. And maybe it shouldn't. Because some scars aren't there to remind me of pain. They're there to remind me of overcoming. Every medicine I take today tastes of resistance. Every meal I cook, every piece of laundry I hang on the line, every word I write in my notebook. Everything carries a new weight now. A value that only those who were almost forgotten understand. This story isn't about revenge. It's about transformation. About silent decisions that change destinies. About hidden truths that time reveals when we're ready to see them. I didn't wish harm on anyone. But life has a very precise way of giving back what we sow. And, looking at everything that happened, I can calmly say, if you sow abandonment, you reap loneliness. But those whose souls are protected, survive even the poison of their own family. And it is this strength that I carry with me now. Not as a shield, but as a legacy. Because one day, my grandchildren will hear this story. Not to learn to fear, but to learn not to repeat it. And, most importantly, to know that there is a kind of justice that doesn't scream but never fails. A justice that begins when we choose to live truthfully, even when the world tries to erase us in silence. If you've stuck with me this far, it's because this story touched something deep inside you too. And perhaps, in some way, my experience has lit a light in your own memories, your decisions, your silent strengths. If this kind of truth resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. Here, we transform pain into conversation, injustice into reflection, and silence into voice. Take advantage and leave a comment here. This message was for me. Just so I know you walked with me until the end. And if this video made you think, made you feel, leave a like. Not because of the number, but because of the connection we created, even without seeing each other. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. There's more history, more truth, and more life waiting for you.